I'm really happy everybody has come to the big tent. What I thought I would do is make a few remarks on the general subject of the world and the status of it. I will not talk about Washington. We do that a lot here, and you guys, of course, are experts. And then take your questions and comments in the time that we have remaining. So be very interested in what you think about some of my arguments or whether you have some new ideas, because that's ultimately how the world will change. And I wanted to begin with a quote from a Myanmar Burmese dissident who was jailed for 18 months and who I had dinner with. He said, "Without the internet, our children will be blind as we are." And I heard this from a fellow in Inle Lake, which is the most beautiful place in the whole world, I think. And he had been held in a prisoner in one of these cells, with 20 guys in one of these, 10-foot by 10-foot things in these horrific situations. And the American sense of fair play and how to treat people is not universally understood. And when you talk to these people, you understand the human suffering at the hands of dictatorships and autocratic governments, you want to do something about it. And I've decided to spend my time, and perhaps the rest of my life, working on how information can make the world a better place. I genuinely believe this. Now, what's interesting is that Myanmar, Burma, depending on who you ask, was a totalitarian state closed for almost 50 years, run by a military junta. And for reasons which are debated, 18 months ago it opened up. And they're now in the process of now turning on everything, turning on the banking system, turning on the internet. They have essentially no internet penetration, and although they say they have cell phones, none of them work. That's sort of where they are. And as this veil comes on, right, how are they going to deal with the openness of the internet? As the government opens, right, will the clashes between the Buddhists and the Muslims, right, which had been suppressed brutally before by the government and particularly by the army, will that come to define this revolution? Will the internet ultimately be a place where the witnessing to the terrible crimes by the previous government are expressed and people are held to justice, or will in fact the country slide back? People I know who study this say that democracy and the path to democracy is not a simple switch. It just doesn't go from the old model to the new model. That democracy takes a very, very long time to achieve, at the balance of society. And you're seeing this in these brand new governments. And it's interesting that in Myanmar, as an example, and by the way, the salaries there are $2 a day on average, and 40% of the children are malnourished to the point of mental retardation. This is a problem. SIM cards used to cost $5,000. As of a month ago, they were down to $2, which is still not affordable by most people. So that's how much of a gap they've gone on. Of course, I went to the computer university and met various people. A former Googler who'd graduated from Stanford had moved back, to reorganize their countries. So even in these places, there is courage and there is conviction. It's interesting that of the 20 top fastest growing mobile countries in terms of mobile adoption, 80% are categorized as being in very serious situations by Reporters Without Borders. So this is the norm, not the exception. Somehow we think that the mobile revolution is done in normal ways with normal police and so forth. The average experience is that mobility, and in particular empowerment, comes for people who have no trust in the police, an oppressive government, restrictions on their speech, and God knows what religious and other tensions within their society. So Jared and I, as the co-author of the book that Susan mentioned, have met a lot of very interesting people. We were in Pakistan, and we were, and I'll never forget this, we visited a group of women who had been attacked horrifically by men with acid on their face. Now, this would make you cry to see it. The acid, half of them die from the infections, and the other half end up being blind because the acid eventually gets their optical nerve. And of course, their faces are horrifically scarred, and they're scarred for life. What they've been doing, the only thing that they can really do in that society is they can become virtual people. They can be on the virtual network. They don't have this ailment. They can work hard. They can be successful. They can build businesses and so forth. So you think the internet matters? It matters to somebody without a face. It matters, especially for a woman for which the shame is horrific. and let alone the opportunity to go perpetrate and find the perpetrators and put them to justice in this horrific crime. It was interesting that in North Korea, when we were there, we visited with the government. Of course, that's all there are in North Korea is the government. And we went to the Korean Computer Center, North Korean Computer Center, and they asked us all about future versions of Android. Obviously, they have access, at least to the government, of what we're doing, as if I was going to tell them the future roadmap of Android to the North Koreans. I obviously didn't. You wonder about why technology matters. We were in Libya and we visited with schoolgirls who had used Google Maps to mark the current and expected locations of NATO bombings so they could get to school and not be killed. You think it matters? Yeah, with their lives. On and on. We went to Ciudad Juarez, which is in Mexico, one of the sort of worst murder capitals in the world because of the drug things. It's so dangerous for police there that they wear masks. And yet we found a vibrant community that was using an online world, both to track what was going on, to record it, and a possible eventual problem being built in that the government is now using an online system to invade the privacies of all the citizens so they can figure out which ones are the terrible, drug lords. Well, what protections do you have as a Mexican citizens of that being used for other reasons? We don't know. These are some of the problems these countries are facing. When we were in Afghanistan, we heard the story from the Navy SEALs that we met that they had, there were 2 raids by the Taliban, 2 different cities or towns, I guess, in Afghanistan. The first town, the Taliban asked them to give up their phones. The citizens revolted. The Taliban did not occupy the town. The second one, they learned their lesson. They let the citizens keep the phones. They took over the town. Right, so you think phones matter? They matter a lot. It's how you survive in those environments. So in a context where 57% of cyberspace, 57% of the world's population lives in autocratic regimes, what we're going to see is we're going to see this one-way valve from sort of the non-connected world to the connected world. And this is going to happen whether we like it or not, by the way. This is going to happen. There are 5 million or so, 6 billion or so mobile phones in the world, of which 5 billion or so are feature phones or SMS phones. They don't have browsers. They're going to get upgraded. They're going to get upgraded again whether we like it or not. In fact, many of those will be Android phones, which is quite interesting. As the prices fall, everyone's going to move to that. So when that happens, all of a sudden we're going to hear the distinct voices of the citizens in these countries in a way we've never heard before. And by the way, they're just like us. They're human beings, they're curious, they want the right things for their children, they want good health, they don't want war, all those kinds of things. And what's the problem? The governments are not like our governments, right? As much as we malign here in Washington, D.C., the fact of the matter is this is a democracy, right? And a rule of law country. In a world where you have an autocrat, all of a sudden now you have this huge empowerment going on to these people in these countries. In that context, governments are going to work really, really hard to stop this. Because the way to really get a dictator going is to threaten their authority, which is indeed how revolutions occur. So this mobile revolution that we're all sort of part of will become the defining story for most people in the next 5 to 10 years. This empowerment fight, where they're all of a sudden empowered. And by the way, their expectations are higher of their government, and their government's ability to deal with them is, if anything, poorer. Because the normal solution for a government, which is transparency and saying what you do, is exactly the wrong strategy if you're a dictator. Because your goal of being a dictator and autocrat is to get your unfair share of the natural resources and power and control over the society. So this defines, for most human beings on the planet, how their worlds will go on. And they're going to do things like restrict speech, and they're going to restrict assembly, but they're going to find it impossible to do as comprehensively as they can in physical space. Because people here, and there's some projects here in Washington and others that are trying to empower people even in those kinds of situations. And what's interesting is that I had always thought that the absolute worst place was North Korea. And I've since discovered that there is in fact a worse place, which is Eritrea, which I have not yet been able to go to, but is my objective. They have a near total news blackout, And in fact, there was, in fact, a coup, as best we could tell, in January, but no one bothered to report it or discover it until March. Think about how isolated these poor Eritreans are, right, splitting off out of Ethiopia and so forth. And the censors were only successful. The censors were so successful that the only statement that was actually got out of the country was a statement that there was not a coup. Okay, why would you announce that there wasn't a coup? Unless there had been one. But maybe my Western logic doesn't apply to such an isolated country. You never know. We started publishing here at Google something called a transparency report. I'm very, very proud of this. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I would like you guys to look at it. And we publish yesterday we published the latest numbers. And I don't know if you've talked about this in your other activities here in Washington. It's quite interesting. YouTube is blocked in Pakistan and Iran and Bangladesh. Blogger is blocked in Turkey. Google Earth is blocked in Morocco. Interesting. Our products have been inaccessible at some point in more than 30 countries. And these are not just takedown requests. They block the whole site. Right? Now, you think that's fun. Imagine the Iranian government. So the Iranian government last year announced they're going to have their own internet, which they called the halal internet, which presumably would not have the kind of information that they don't like. It's unclear whether they've implemented that, because it's hard to deal with and figure out what's really going on in Iran. But last week, they announced they're going to do their own Google Earth. It's perfect, right? They can have the Iranian Earth without Israel in it. We'll just delete Israel. We just won't have them because they're kind of pesky and kind of obnoxious to us. I mean, that's a facetious joke, by the way. Please do not Twitterize that. I was just being funny. That was humor. I apologize to those of you offended by my joke. The fact of the matter is that this is the madness of this kind of thinking. Let's just delete stuff, right? Let's just censor it. Let's just prevent it because we don't want people to know the truth. And these cover tens and tens of millions of people, let alone what's going on in China, which is a whole other story, which I'll get to in a sec. So what happens is that the influential nature of a country with respect to physical resources, military power, is also now going to be affected by their ability to affect cyberspace. We think about Estonia, right, the world's most open internet government in many, many ways, or Sweden, which is unusually good at security software for some reason, presumably involving cold, or something, God knows, right? But the fact of the matter is, they can punch above their weight, right, in a new way. It's a new foreign policy for these countries. Now, anybody here know the day in the 365 days in the year that has the lowest amount of hacking, phishing, and botnet attacks on the world? Anyone know? Turns out it's the Chinese New Year. No, I'm not making this up. That's not a joke. Okay, as opposed to the previous joke. So in the physical world, China and the U.S. get along, pretty well. I mean, there's tensions and so forth, but there's enormous trade. Everybody talks to each other. We're not shooting at each other and so forth. But in cyberspace, whole nother strategy, right? And everybody knows the details of the most recent set of Chinese attacks. And it looks to me like you could end up in a situation where countries would do stuff in cyberspace that they would never, ever, ever do in physical space. So, I wonder, for example, a small number of you are old enough, to remember Dr. Strangelove as a movie. But I imagine the following scenario. The Chinese are having fun in cyberspace, and some rogue general actually manages to do something in cyberspace by accident that does something in physical space. So the Chinese premier calls up President Obama, and as far as I know, this has not happened, so this is just speculation, always a mistake. But it's just speculation, and he says, sorry, we didn't mean to do it. And meanwhile, there's some real physical problem on the ground here in the United States. How is America going to respond? Or even better, let's imagine a third party actually does it, and they blame the poor Chinese, who for this one time are not guilty. Because on the online world, the notion of attribution is much harder. It's perfectly possible for a third party to come in, right? We'd have our list of usual suspects, but in fact, these kinds of things can ultimately lead to some very significant activities. So to me, countries are going to face these kinds of questions, and many of them are going to go the wrong way. And as Susan set it up, I think, quite well, we as a group, we as a country, we as individuals, we've got to fight against this. They're going to be tempted to get control over this. They're going to be tempted to filter and to otherwise restrict what's going on. You can imagine all sorts of things could happen. I'll make another one up. This is just speculation. Imagine we had the CIS, right? Remember the USSR, former republics, and they're so mad at the Russians that they decide to actually make their own internet and eliminate all the Russian content. We're just going to delete all those Russians, right? So you can see it's not just the Russians that might do that, but the people who didn't like the Russians follow the reasoning. So what I like about this, and what I like thinking about it, is that you have all of these opportunities. So we've got to get sort of three things right, and I'll sort of take you through what they are. We have to build sort of tunnels and bridges across the world to prevent this balkanization. There are technical solutions to how to do this, but fundamentally they involve peer-to-peer communications protocols, the use of Bluetooth, and so forth. There's a lot of promise that the sum of this will allow that. The second is that we've got to protect the voices in the digital debate. We've got to make sure that voices are not being silenced. Look at the Navalny case in Russia, if you want to see an example. Sort of the most famous blogger now facing the very real threat of prison, which of course would silence him for quite some time. And then the third issue has to do with security. And an example would be denial of service attacks. If you have a 2-year-old birthday party, and you have 10 2-year-olds and all having their little birthday party, a denial of service attack is 20,000 2-year-olds come in and they interfere, right? So you imagine 20,000 come in to interfere with the party. And denial of service is like that. And we're seeing an explosion of these kinds of attacks. So to me, we need a model where we can address each of these. People are working on these. And what I will tell you is that catalyzing local sharing in these toughest environments is an honorable goal. When we were in South Sudan, we discovered that people were smuggling micro SD cards, because micro SD cards had enough capacity that they would go onto the phones, and people were consuming information about their world on their mobile phones using micro SD cards. There was so little connectivity. The hunger for information is that profound. In that model, you have so many ways in which you want to get information. The proof is that even in extreme circumstances, we've always been willing to risk our lives. On and on and on. I can give you example after example. So by looking at sort of the choices here, I think we have sort of two philosophical things, and I'll finish and let you guys ask questions or comments. The first is that we can sort of, I want to say, bunker down or innovate. So the bunker down is, okay, we're going to protect ourselves, we're going to sort of increase our firewalls. We like the way the US and the Western world. The alternative is to say we're going to try to make this integrated model work, and we're going to deal with these issues. And I think that it's possible, and I think it's through innovation. I already said we have to create these virtual tunnels and bridges. We have to protect the voices in the digital debate, and we've got to catalyze sharing of one kind or another. We've got to make it possible for people in the worst possible situation that they can at least communicate. I think that one thing that we could do, it would be wrong, would be to fight by militarizing the internet. Okay, we're going to view this as sort of a weapons space, and we're going to sort of put our guns and so forth. That's not really the right technical solution, and it will also create the wrong values. It's much better to take a view that we want to hear all the voices, we want to empower them as much as we can, we want to encourage innovation from wherever it is, and I think that the choice that we have in front of us is so obviously correct from an American values perspective that we as all should be put it. I'm an optimist at heart, but I've learned to be a pragmatist. I'm very worried that this extraordinary creation that I've been part of, that you guys have been part of, could get shut down. Imagine a world that's bifurcated or bisectored, whatever it is, along these lines. Think about how uninteresting it would be if you couldn't reach France or Germany or Africa or so forth. It is technically possible for governments to do this. It's technically possible for them to censor your voice. We should fight as hard as we possibly can against it. So maybe we have time for some questions. Mystique? Thank you.